Hey Rodney, it's
Hey,
Alex.
Alex.
Hey there. How are you?
I'm good. How's it going over there?
Not too bad. Yeah, still stuck in lockdown. It's kind of your film. I think your film is kind of it's the perfect time to have this film out, kind of during this pandemic and this kind of crazy world we're living in. It seems very apt that it's kind of coming out around now. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all interacting with these little video screens, right? That
yeah, yeah, exactly. I thought it was amazing. I really loved the documentary. How did you come to that subject, the kind of simulated reality subject?
well, in some ways it feels like kind of a natural progression from, 237, where people are trying to understand a film, and the nightmare where people are, thinking about dreams, to
Mm,
the nature of reality. But I mean, the truth is it wasn't as premeditated as that. Just that in talking with people over the course of the nightmare, simulation theory presented itself at one point as an idea of what was happening in that heightened state of consciousness. And
oh,
then I very kind of quickly fell into that rabbit hole and found it coming up in conversation, um, more and more and more around me. And maybe one of the key moments too were when I started seeing like chat lines and message boards where people were sharing, personal stories of, inexplicable things that happened to them that
mm,
suggested that they were in a simulation. And all of a sudden I was able to see, well, instead of just talking about, the theory as an abstract concept, that we'd be able to get people recounting these, first person stories, and reflecting on what those mean. And you know I don't know that there's, anyone who hasn't lived through some unexplainable series of coincidences that suggests
yeah.
that somebody's got their finger on the scale.
Yeah. So was it that people who experience the sleep paralysis, one way for them to understand it was maybe in terms of that, in terms of a simulated reality?
Yeah, well, that was, in that moment, it's
Mm,
like that. It's like that moment in the Matrix, right, where Neo could see the code raining down.
mm,
That
wow. Mm, yeah. The interviews, I love how that, like you say, they're all kind of conducted like this over kind of over video calls, and you have these like amazing like avatars for the four interviewees. Was that, I guess, was it to hide their identity, or was it, did they have kind of a like did they have a hand in the design of what those characters look like at all, or?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily about anonymity. It was more
Mm,
about talking about both this sort of mismatch of feeling like you in the, of reality and
mm,
unreality, as well
yeah,
as sort of exaggerating, where digital communications, are going. We're
yeah,
speaking through not necessarily avatars, but little video windows. But as often as not, you know, on social media, I've got a icon that I'm always switching
mm,
out to be one thing or the other, or communicating through emojis and gifs, or
mm,
chatting with other people, even within sort of networked video games.
yeah.
That so that kind of thing, felt like a kind of an apt way to allow the form of the movie to reflect the subject.
Mm. It's brilliant because it's quite jarring at first, but then when you start kind of showing their stories and their experiences, it's such a brilliant way of kind of having that world computer generated, but having them actually appear in it. Right? I thought it was a really clever kind of artistic kind of like, I don't know, just a really really great way of kind of bringing you in and making those stories feel real.
Yeah, thanks. That was, sort of a lucky side effect that, we wouldn't need to hire an actor who looks a little bit like them and fit them with a fit them with a wig to make them look a little
Yeah.
more like the interviewee.
Yeah. It's kind of like, we're listening to those four people talk. It kind of, to me it felt like, instead of kind of the idea of gods or god, they'd kind of swapped that for a game or an algorithm, like a game or an algorithm. And it kind of, do you think, did you get the sense that they were comforted by not being in control of their own lives at all?
Um, I don't know if I would say comforted, but certainly, the notion that it becomes an almost religious idea, is something that came up again and again and again. In fact, I was kind of surprised at how frequently people would bring it up literally. I
Mm,
could see it, metaphorically coming up that, oh yeah, in some ways it's a different kind of creation myth, right? That,
mm.
did God create the world in 6 days using the word, or did, some third grader create it, while cramming on an over on a long weekend on their PlayStation. But yeah, I mean, very, 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 very quickly they all sort of started to deep into dig into the almost religious
Mm.
ramifications of the idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like quite a spiritual experience when they, like in the deprivation tank, and the guy who has it a realization in church, even though he's not very religious. It was a very religious experience when they pulled back the curtain, as it were. It seemed quite a big feeling for them all.
Yeah, well, and especially the one, the when like Brother Mistwood wrote us originally and talked about that deprivation chamber experience. I immediately thought that would be an interesting story to tell, because not just because, wow, that's an unusual thing that happened to that guy, but
Mm,
that's something that's happened to many people, right? It happened
mm,
to Philip K. Dick when, after his
yeah.
dental surgery and that pink
Mm,
laser hit him from outer space. Or, you go back again to Bible stories, and, like Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, where
mm,
he was overcome with a sudden
yeah.
inspiration. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I thought those connections were really kind of compelling.
Mm. Talking of the Philip K. Dick, there's that you interweave a lot of that amazing footage from that talk he did in France, and I thought it's kind of you kind of keep seeing him, and he looks so nervous, and you keep seeing the audience, and they look so shocked. Do you
Yeah.
think, like, why do you, I kind of wonder why he chose that moment to kind of reveal those controversial beliefs, or like what was kind of going through his head to go, right, this is where I'm going to tell people what I think. It's quite.
Yeah, I haven't found out that much about, the days, weeks, months before that, before that appearance. But I mean, clearly this is something that he'd been wrestling
Mm.
with for, I guess it was about 3 years, right? Because that
Yeah.
experience happened to him in 1974, and at a certain point, he went public with it.
Mm. Yeah, it's just like their faces. I think it's obviously clear that they were there to hear about books, and he starts saying these things that are kind of like blowing their minds. Like,
Yeah, and well, you
yeah.
can imagine the poor translator having to try to keep up.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I wonder if how much of it actually got through the translation, if some of it was lost a little bit. I don't know. I also thought, like, I think one of the great, like, your film, it's very much like Room 237 in that one of the main themes of the film is the power of cinema and of movies. Why do you think The Matrix was such a huge? Why did it have such a big impact on audiences and on pop culture?
Well, I mean, there's both, I mean, I talked a little bit about the style and the substance of this one, which are much less dramatic than, what they were able to pull off in The Matrix.
Mm,
But I mean,
yeah.
again, that's the ultimate collision of style and substance, right? That movie looked like nothing that had come before it. Afterwards, every action science fiction movie looked old fashioned in comparison to the way
Yeah.
that they were able to, the bullet time and the way they were able to choreograph, those incredible kind of Hong Kong inspired action
Mm,
scenes. Um, so, I think it's all in a way. I see a big comparison with The Shining too. That
mm,
people are drawn to both of those movies, both because they've got big ideas, but they're also fun, rewarding pop cinematic
mm,
experiences. Right,
yeah.
like 2001 is, arguably a deeper movie than The Shining, but
Mm.
it's not as much of a crowd pleaser, perhaps. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no,
yeah,
I agree.
which allowed The Shining to, sort of drill its way into more people's heads. It's
Mm,
also, I mean, I think the something I came to figure out at a certain point is that something as mundane as the aspect ratio of The Shining
mm,
allowed it to play in home video better than 2001, which
Yeah.
before high definition TVs, it was like a bumper sticker playing in the middle of
Yeah.
of a 17-inch screen. You could barely, you could barely make out the image or appreciate the compositions. And The Shining, there was famously, he filmed it so that you can remove the mat and play it full frame on a standard def TV without losing any image. And sometimes it's funny little things like that allow a movie to kind of reach that broad of an audience. And The Matrix didn't present itself like homework. I mean, it was a kick-ass action, cathartic experience that snuck those ideas in, sort of with a spoonful of sugar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole film was kind of quite like unsettling, but definitely one of the kind of hardest bits of the film is the Joshua Cook kind of story about how what he did and his obsession with the Matrix and how he led to him kind of murdering his parents. Because you kind of say that he went on to write a book, and is he still in prison? What kind of happened after those events? How did his life progress after that?
Well, I mean, he went straight to prison, and he's still there for another, 20 some years. But I mean, I think, been, working to become a better person as best he can while in there, and he's become, really religious, and again, he's trying to reach out to people with that book, and even by participating in this film. A pretty straight line for, I mean, when you get to what happened to him after the movie. He went to prison, and he's still there, but trying to reach out, and it sounds like, it's fun, like speaking to him. He sounds, very rational, very reflective, very conscious of what he did, the consequences of it, and where he's at now, even though by most accounts, it doesn't sound like he's gotten, a huge amount of therapy, that most of it has been hard work that, he's done, on his own, or, with his peers in there.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite, I think it's interesting because that story very clearly paints the point that you say about how the kind of dehumanization, the idea that if we are in a simulated reality, we can just do what we want to each other. It doesn't really matter because no one's real and all that. Like, kind of, I think that story kind of really like brings it home that, like the reality of that, because that could get,
Well, because for a while, talking about simulation is, kind of fun, stony, speculative game of what if. It's like that conversation in Animal House about a tiny planet is one molecule of your thumbnail, man, and maybe our whole universe is a molecule in some giant thumbnail, and that's kind of that's kind of fun in its way. But there's certainly anything that can suggest that you can divide people into the important ones and the unessential ones is incredibly dangerous. And simulation theory isn't the only philosophy that leads you to that place. But at a certain point, it felt important, to tie this stuff more to real world consequences and to get out of the abstract theorizing, which is where, and I kind of discovered Josh's story, because, in my sort of research about simulation theory, I discovered the Matrix defense.
Right? That's fascinating. And the fact that there's like the taxi driver defense as well. Yeah.
Well, and in San Francisco, there was the Twinkie defense, which was when
what was that?
there was there was a politician in San Francisco, Harvey Milk, a very progressive, I forget what office he served, openly gay, which was a big deal in the 70s, I think, when his story went down. And he was shot by, I think it was a policeman who shot him. And his defense, which didn't carry a whole lot of water, was that he'd been eating a lot of junk food and was on sort of a sugar high and couldn't control himself.
God,
so the Twinkie defense is a little less substantial than the taxi driver defense or the Matrix defense, but if you're going to do a roundup of unusual criminal defense theories,
Yeah, but
it might have a cameo.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as pop culture becomes more kind of meaningful and significant to people, those kind of like those arguments are going to become have a bit more weight behind them.
Well, and when they say the Matrix, they don't literally mean the film, or they don't always mean that. It's shorthand for simulation theory that if you don't think the world is real, then like what I think a big part of the insanity defense, right, is whether you understand the ramifications of your actions. And if you think you're in a big video game, then you don't really understand. It would go to follow that you don't really understand the consequences.
No.
So the way Josh tells the story, it's like they made themselves apparent very, very quickly. Once everything happened.
Yeah. I also love that section about the guy who kind of sees himself as an NPC, and about his job and some of that. And it really made me think about how there are certain jobs or certain places where you all wear the same uniform, you've got a script, you're doing repetitive jobs. It's almost like those businesses are turning kind of you into that kind of non-player character in a way. It's almost like their manifesto is to do that. It's kind of, do you think those sorts of jobs have given a rise to the kind of popularity of the simulation theory?
I haven't considered that before, but I mean, it's very plausible the way that you talk about it. Certainly, it makes the metaphor that much easier to grasp, right?
Yeah, it's just kind of if you work for one of the big chains or whatever, doing whatever, you're wearing the same thing. You're told how your interactions should go. Like you've got that great bit where you have the little graph of if they say this, say that, and we are just all being certain jobs are kind of pushing you to be just repeating a script, and you would start to kind of doubt your own your own presence almost in that.
Yeah, and certainly your agency, right? And you're not, and in that kind of a role, you're not encouraged to show independent thought. And to say, I've considered a better way to do this. May well be seen as stepping out of line.
Yeah, it's kind of deleting your individuality to give a repetitive an outcome every time. They want the business might want the same. They want everyone to get the same kind of thing from each interaction. It's kind of it's a bit depressing.
I mean, think about the beginning of Full Metal Jacket, right? Where everybody gets their head buzzed, so that their individuality is being stripped away as they're being made into cogs in a machine.
Yeah,
I mean, just that one, that opening credit sequence is so brilliant, and in a way, it could stand alone as a as a powerful short film.
Yeah. We kind of, on my podcast I do with my friends, we've done a few kind of simulated reality themed sci-fis, like we Surrogates, Dark City, World on a Wire, which was one I didn't know anything about until that
one's amazing. I love that. I love World on a Wire. Yeah.
Yeah, we had to do it in two. It's got in two parts. We had to do it in the two parts, but it's fascinating that film how kind of ahead of its time it was. It kind of a lot of the Matrix.
It's like 20 years. Like 20 years ahead of its time.
Yeah,
right.
And also, with
the 13th Floor is based on the same book.
Oh yeah, and also I thought it was interesting in World on a Wire because in that, I think they're running the simulation to solve their own energy problem, I think it is. And that was kind of some of the guys in your film were kind of saying, oh, maybe the simulation is to kind of work out like that was that kind of the theory they'd come to as well.
Well, that makes the most sense, right? I mean, if I was to speculate on what's the purpose of the simulation, like Nick Bostrom talks about ancestor simulators, which to me suggests, though, I mean, the idea of ancestor simulators suggests to me that you would create a simulation of the past in order to study it like a historian.
Yeah.
But if you made which is, one possibility, I suppose, and then you can come in and make a 3D IMAX doc about all sorts of historical events that happened at the onset before the invention of photography. But I mean, what logically makes sense to me is if you've got a problem outside the simulation that you create, 100, 10, 100, 1,000 worlds and introduce that problem into each of them, make each one a little bit different. You have Brexit passes in this one and it doesn't pass in this one.
Yeah,
And
see which one survives.
And see which one see which one solves your problem.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that really kind of, the whole Mandela effect of people remembering products looking one way and then being another way, that kind of really chimes in with that, because it's almost like that was another reality where Kit Kats had a hyphen, or, you know, those little changes that people say, they've seen happen.
Yeah, well, and that thing is, and I thought it was funny that the Mandela effect thing sort of echoed Philip K. Dick's idea that remembering things having been a little bit different in the past, it was sort of that he presented that as, you know, evidence that the simulators had been changing the variables around, and that some of us would have a memory of how things used to be. And it's like, well, it was like 40 years later, you're not the only, you know, 40 years later, you know, there's this active page on Reddit where people are cataloging thousands of them.
He's obviously, he would probably feel good that he's not alone out there, you know, if he'd known about it.
No, he was the canary. He was the canary in the coal mine of, you know, sort of 1,000 21st century anxieties.
Do you have, like, apart from the Matrix, do you have a favorite kind of simulated reality sci-fi yourself, or is there one that you really love?
I'm especially partial to Existenz.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that is great. And
I think one of the brilliant things he did, you know, was you know, make the video game interface that biological thing, which instantly puts it into a universe tangential to ours, but also in a very canny way keeps it from dating, right? You know, the things that always date the worst, you know, are tech devices in a futuristic movie. Sidestep that, you know, pretty elegantly.
Yeah, and that's got a great kind of NPC scene when they go and, I think they go and see someone and they say that the person says the line of dialogue, and Jude Law starts talking and he's not given the right response, so the guy just keeps repeating himself because he hasn't had the prompt of the dialogue to kind of move forward the story. It's great.
And it's so beautiful just to see a human actor kind of emulating that that notion.
No, definitely.
It's kind of a brilliant scene. There's an amazing scene at the beginning of Virtuosity too, where they're kind of surrounded by 1,000 NPCs, but you know, again, it's you know, it's not digitally created. It's just, you know, done with like 1,000 extras who are all dressed identically in downtown Los Angeles.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. We'll have to check that one out on our podcast. I've been asked to wrap things up, sadly, but I guess do you have any plans for anything like your next documentary? Is there any ideas or subject matters you might be looking at next?
Nothing I can really announce. You know, there's 2 or 3 things that I am you know, that I'm juggling right now. One of them is actually scripted, but there are sort of elements of it that feel like, you know, a nonfiction, you know, kind of hybrid collision of documentary and scripted drama. And one of the doc things that I'm approaching is, maybe because of a change of pace, is a comedy.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, I watch a lot of horror films, but The Nightmare is still one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen. Like I still would, if people ask me what one of the scariest films is, I would say The Nightmare. And my friend who I do the podcast with, he can't watch it because he's actually had sleep paralysis, so he kind of refuses to watch it. So a comedy would be a change of pace, definitely. Yeah, well, thank you so much for talking to me. And like I say, I think it's a brilliant film, and I hope it gets kind of. I hope there's a lot of people out there who see it, because I think it just makes you think, and it really it does your head in a great way. So thank you.
I appreciate that, and I dig your Total Recall shirt.
Oh yes. I thought it was appropriate. I was trying to be on brand for the conversation.
Dig it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Rodney.
Good to talk to you, Alex.
Okay.